Okay, anybody else still working? Is that it? All right. Go. Yeah. All right. Going to talk a little bit more about some HTML. Kind of go over a couple of just extra things that didn't really fit in the lecture so far. So kind of covering some extra stuff that we need to. And then after this lecture, we'll be done with HTML, and we'll move on to CSS. So, all right. So first, just a little bit about the history of HTML, which is kind of important to understand, as a web developer, how HTML came to be and where it's headed. We talk about HTML5 a lot. What is HTML5? So HTML was invented around 1989 by Tim Berners-Lee at CERN. Has anyone ever heard of CERN? It's where they have like the Large Hadron Collider. It's a particle physics research facility in Switzerland. It's interesting that that's kind of where HTML was invented. It kind of started, as well as just the internet in general, at research institutions. So like, even just a handful of universities and large research institutions is kind of where the internet got started. And so Tim Berners-Lee invented HTML as a simple way to mark up documents to share them over the internet is kind of where it started. There were actually several kind of alternatives at the time too. There were sort of some competing standards, and HTML kind of won out just by adoption. More people started using HTML because they found it useful. So it beat out some other technologies that didn't end up being adopted. So anyway, that's kind of where HTML got started, just as a simple way to share research documents, scientific, findings and reports and stuff like that. The HTML specification is maintained by the World Wide Web Consortium, or the W3C, which is made up of industry leaders from companies like Google, Apple, and Microsoft, government officials, nonprofit leaders. So it's kind of an independent organization that has taken over kind of the oversight of HTML as well as CSS and JavaScript. So Tim Berners-Lee invented it, but it grew, and more and more people used it, and eventually the W3C was created to kind of provide oversight as an independent body. So there's all kinds of people on the board from stakeholders, companies, and stuff that sort of have a vote, have some say in what HTML, what features should be adopted, what changes should be made. So HTML4 was finalized around 1999. That's kind of been the main, the leading version up until the last couple of years. But HTML has been finalized for about 2 years, probably 3 now. Browsers are still kind of catching up to support it. So the way it works is the W3C, they'll take years to develop a specification for a new document. So they'll take, submissions for new features people think should be added. If someone thinks a new element should be added, they can submit that as an idea. The W3C will consider it. Someone has to develop an official technical specification. They'll vote on it. Eventually, they get enough features. They say, okay, this is a new version. Let's vote on this version. They let everyone know ahead of time what's going to be in it, what's not going to be in it. And then eventually, they'll approve it. So they're like, okay, this is the approved version. Then it's up to the browsers to actually implement that new version, right? So the W3C they say, here's the documents that explain what HTML is, and the browser developers then have to go, okay, I need to add this element, I need to add this stuff, and kind of adopt their browser to match the new specification. So at this point, HTML5 is pretty much 100% adopted. IE is really the only issue. Some older versions of IE don't support it. So if you ever have to deal with IE 8 or 9, I believe, is as far back as it's not supported. Modern IE, of course, is fine. So generally, HTML5 is pretty safe to use unless you specifically know you have users still using like Windows 7 even, could be an issue. They could have an older IE installed. So anyway, HTML5 is the latest and greatest. I think they're working on HTML6, but it's not really very finalized yet. So we'll talk a little bit about HTML5 a little bit later as well. So because HTML has evolved over time, the doc type is a way to indicate which version of HTML the browser should use. So when you're developing your website, you use the doc type to tell the browser which version you're using. This used to be really important, and it still is important, but HTML5 has simplified the doc type a lot. So this is what the doc type looks like for HTML5. It's just the exclamation point doc type and then HTML. Pretty simple. Part of the HTML5 specification is that you no longer need to indicate the version in the doc type, and just HTML is fine. It used to look like this. So if you ever see a doc type that looks like this is what an HTML4 doc type looks like. And there used to be all kinds of options you could provide in your doc type. So like 4.01, you could really be specific on the version. Transitional, and also this loose, you could kind of say how strict the standard should be applied. But that's all kind of gone away in favor of the simpler, just doc type HTML. The doc type should always be the very first thing in your HTML file. So we sort of skipped over this when we talked about the HTML tag and then the body tag, or the head tag and then your body tag. So this doc type HTML should go before your opening HTML tag. Really, really important that that's the very first thing. There aren't even supposed to be any blank lines ahead of your doc type, so it needs to be the first line in your HTML file. Usually I think it still works without it. The browser will just kind of guess. They'll assume, hey, it's probably HTML. But in order to be standards compliant, you need to have that doc type in there. Okay, comments in HTML. Some of you guys have figured this out already. But you can add comments to your HTML code, and they won't show up on the page. So the comments aren't visible to the reader. They're just for us to use as the developers to kind of make notes to ourselves in our HTML. This is what comments look like in HTML. If you've used other languages, you maybe seen like / is the way to indicate a comment. In HTML, you use the angle brackets like you're starting a tag. Then you use the exclamation point -- to open it. And then when you close it, you do -- and then you're closing angle bracket. It's kind of an annoying syntax, I feel. But in most of your code editors, you can use like command / to insert a comment. And you can even usually highlight stuff and then hit command / and it'll comment everything you've highlighted. So that kind of makes it easier. You don't usually have to manually type that comment syntax. You should add comments often to explain portions of your code to your future self or other future developers. So a lot of times, I'll work on some code that I wrote many years ago, and I'll forget that I wrote it, and I'm like, what on earth was the person who wrote this thinking? And then I'll find a comment, and I'm like, oh, that was me. But thankfully, I left myself a comment explaining why I did something. So it's kind of a learned skill, learning when to comment. But anytime you feel a little bit like, this was kind of difficult to figure out how to do, or this seems a little bit strange the way that I'm doing this, leave a comment explaining why you're doing it. It doesn't have to be long or, incredibly thorough, not like paragraphs, but just say like, doing this to fix this issue or something like that. Super, super helpful, especially if your code's ever going to be written on top of by someone else. Leaving comments in there explaining what certain parts do is really helpful. I also like to do comments on like closing tags for big sections, or even maybe, in your opening. But a lot of times, and you'll notice this when you start doing longer pages, your HTML will get a little bit unwieldy because you'll start like a section and you'll have a bunch of content, and then you'll have a closing tag for your section. So usually when I have closing tags for big chunks, I like to add a comment indicating which section I'm closing, just so it's a little bit easier to tell. That can be useful sometimes. Even just breaking out, separating different sections of your HTML might be useful to use comments to kind of say, okay, this is the header part, this is the main body, this is, some other part. Comments can be seen by doing view source though. If you do view source or open up a page in the developer tools inspector, you can see comments there. So don't include any sensitive information in a comment. I think one of the recent, like the Equifax hack that happened, it's been 6 months now at least or more. I think literally somewhere someone found a password in a comment on an HTML page. And they were able to use that to bypass some stuff and ended up hacking into Equifax. So don't ever put any sensitive information in comments because people can see them. Commenting out a line of code is a good way to temporarily remove it as well. So if you've got a section of your site and you want to maybe try doing it a different way, but you don't want to just delete everything, comment it out so it won't actually be rendered in your page, and that'll let you try something else, and then you can always bring it back if you want to. And yeah, again, command / or control / usually will do comment for you. Okay, let's talk about the ID attribute. We talked about this a little bit when we were talking about forms, but any element in your HTML can carry an ID attribute, which is used to uniquely identify a specific element on the page. So uniquely, there's the keyword. No two elements should have the same ID because they should be unique. So an ID is indicating one specific element on your page. ID attribute should start with a letter or an underscore, so you can't have a number or like a dash or any other character at the beginning. That's just kind of good to know. I've run into that a couple times where I've used like 2 or something in an ID and it's not valid. Your browser won't like it. So then your ID attribute is then used by your CSS and your JavaScript to interact with that specific element. So at this point in our, for your assignment 2, you don't really need to add IDs anywhere unless it's just for fun, because we're not writing CSS that is then looking for those IDs, or we're not writing JavaScript that's looking for specific elements. So by itself, the ID doesn't do anything. It really becomes powerful when you combine it with CSS, because then you write a style and say, ID main heading, make it bold, something like that. So the ID is how you identify a specific element to use with your CSS or JavaScript. You can also do multiple ID attributes by separating them with a space. So here's what an ID looks like. So we've got a paragraph, our ID of introduction-text, and then maybe ID2 is some other ID that we need with a space. Typically, you only need one ID because, again, it should be unique, but there are a few instances where it might make sense to have more than one. So ID, very important. Similarly, every HTML element can carry a class attribute, which is used to identify several elements that belong to a group. So ID is unique. There should only be, one element with a specific ID. Class is not unique. Class is meant to group elements together. So you can use the class attribute to indicate, multiple elements that are kind of part of the same group. For example, if you want to style some important paragraphs a bit differently, you might give them a class of important. So say you have, 5 different paragraphs on your page. You've got like 20 total paragraphs, but 5 of them are important. You would add this class attribute of important to those paragraphs, and then you can target those with CSS and say all class important paragraphs make it bold or whatever. So again, it's the same as ID, except it's just class equals. So again, multiple elements, even of different types, can carry the same class. So they don't all have to have the same type. You can have paragraphs and links and divs all have the same class. It'll work that way. Similarly, you can separate multiple values for the class attribute with a space. So we've got class equals important and uber important if you needed both of those classes. Here's just an example too of if we also had an ID. You notice like this, the ID here is an important message 1, kind of indicating that that's unique. There might be an important message 2, but there could be multiple importance, if that makes sense. So again, it'll kind of make a little more sense once we get into CSS and we'll look at, why you might use IDs versus classes, but generally IDs are for specific elements, that you need to target. Classes are for groups of elements that are similar in some way, similar in meaning, similar in the way you want to style them, similar in their width, or something like that. You would use a class to indicate that. Any questions so far? Yep.
Does like one overrule the other?
Yeah, good question. Yes and no. We'll talk about this in CSS, but there's some weighting to them. So like IDs are a little bit take priority over classes. If you've targeted both the class and the ID, but differently, the ID will override the class. That's a good question. Okay, block and inline elements. So some elements will always appear on a new line. You may have noticed this. These are called block level elements. So some examples are like headings, paragraphs, ULs and LIs, so list items by default will be on a new line. So those are called block level elements. Some elements, however, will appear to continue on the same line as the preceding element. So they don't by default get a new line. They're just in line. So things like A for links, bold or emphasis, images and inputs, those are all inline elements. You probably noticed this when I was doing the form demo. When you put, form inputs, they're all inline, so they don't each get a new line, so they just kind of run across the page. So I had to add break tags in my demo to kind of break things out. Same goes for like bold or emphasis. You don't want a bold tag to get a new line because you use that within a paragraph. You want it to just flow within the text. So the block or inline property is what indicates how that should work, if they should get a new line or not. So it's important to know what the defaults are. We can change this, which is really handy in CSS. You can adjust whether it's block or inline, but you kind of need to know what the default is in order to do that. So, and those examples aren't exhaustive too. There's other elements that are either block or inline. You can find out with the inspector, or you can just look up the HTML, documentation on the Mozilla Developer Network or W3 Schools or something. It'll tell you if it's block or inline, or it'll just see if it has a new line or not. Okay, div. Div is a really, really important element in HTML. So it allows you to group a set of elements together. It's a block level element. And div doesn't really have any semantic meaning. So all of the elements we've talked about so far have some sort of meaning. So like emphasis or even paragraph, heading, those are all kind of specific things. Div is just kind of a general purpose element. So I think it stands for division or something, but it's basically just an element you can use to group other elements together, and it has arbitrary meaning. It's not, tied to any particular type of content. So in the browser, the contents of the div will start on a new line, but otherwise they're not styled any differently. So div doesn't really do anything specific other than it's a block level container. So the power of divs is you can give them ID and class attributes, which you then use to style them. So it's a good idea to kind of group sections of your page together with a div. So if you think of like a blog post or something, or a blog or something, each blog post would probably be contained within a div. You might have like a div, open your div, you might have a heading, you might have a link, you might have some paragraphs for your blog post, then you close your div, and then you have a new div, a new heading, a new link, so each blog post would be its own div. Because you might want to do things like add margin between the blog posts, stuff like that. So, for example, you might say you had a blog and say you didn't use divs. You could maybe add margin to your headings at the top of the headings. If the heading was the first part of your blog post, you could say, okay, every heading add 20 pixels of margin to the top of it. That would space out, your blog posts. But if you ever changed something, or if you ever added an element ahead of those headings that was still part of the blog post, it would kind of throw everything off. So you want to group things together in divs so you can handle that chunk of content as one element, rather than kind of, figuring out how to make it work without that. So divs are super important. You can use them, you don't want to go too crazy, but you can use them even if you don't necessarily know how you're going to use them for styling. You can just add them to group sections, group chunks of content together wherever it makes sense to kind of treat that whole section as one element. Any questions about divs? Okay, span is an inline equivalent of div. So div is a block element. Every div gets a new line by default. So if you put a div like within a paragraph, it would break up your paragraph. But span is inline, so it can be used for two things similar to divs. It can contain a section of text that has no other suitable element to differentiate it from its surrounding text. So I'll use span sometimes within a paragraph if it doesn't really make sense to use like strong or emphasis or bold, but I want to style a little bit of text differently. You can use a span within text, and give it a class that has some meaning to it to kind of indicate that should be different, and then you'll style it. Or you could group together a number of inline elements. So if you've got some inline elements and you want to kind of group them together, you could use a span to do that. So again, it's kind of a general purpose element. It doesn't do any styling by default, and you can just use it to group together elements, but in an inline way that doesn't get a new line for each one. Similarly, again, we'll use ID and class attributes to style them. Questions about spans? All right. iframe. So iframe allows you to load a separate web page into a small window on an existing web page. Kind of handy. They're kind of going away a little bit. Iframes is kind of a more older approach to doing this, but it still works, and there are still times where it's appropriate to use an iframe. So one of the most common uses is to embed a Google map onto a page. Or even maybe like embed a Facebook feed or like your Instagram feed or something like that. That would traditionally be done using an iframe. Now there's usually JavaScript APIs that will do this for you in a little bit different way, but most of them still provide an iframe format as well, so it's good to know about. iframe uses the following attributes. So it uses source, which is the URL of the page to load inside the frame, height and width. So you have to give the frame a height and width. And you can also have, there's a seamless attribute, which will remove the scroll bars from the frame. So kind of just make it without any borders or scroll bars or anything. Without the seamless attribute, the page is probably going to be bigger than the window you've given it. So it'll have scroll bars to kind of scroll around on it. So for example, you'd have iframe source equals google.com. Height equals 200, width equals 200. And it's not self-closing, so you have to add a closing tag as well, even though there's never really any content inside the tag. It probably should be self-closing, but. One thing to know with iframes, there's something called cross-origin request policy that will prevent you from loading pages outside of your domain on a website most of the time. So by default, so for instance, this wouldn't work. You can't just load google.com within your page because what used to happen, the reason that you can't anymore is you could create, I could create my own web page, craigsgoogle.com, and I could just use an iframe to load Google in there, and now I'm benefiting somehow from, it's like a fake Google, right? So they changed it to where you can't do that anymore, and by default, domains have to opt in to allow their website to load via an iframe on another domain. So Google could say, okay, you're allowed to load google.com in an iframe, and then it would work. So Google Maps will work. You can load Google Maps within an iframe. Like Facebook will provide, I think, an iframe version that you can load a feed within an iframe, stuff like that. If you want to show, some Facebook stuff on your website, something like that. So it's opt-in for domains. So you can't just take any arbitrary website and load it in an iframe. It's kind of a security risk, but specific ones will allow you to do it. Questions about iframes? Okay. Again, typically you don't have to use them, and even for embedding social feeds, there's usually newer, fancier JavaScript methods that just write it directly to your page. But iframes are still valid HTML. So, okay, meta tags. So meta elements will go inside your head element. So we talked about the head element that right now all we really know about is the title. But there's other stuff that can go in there that contains information about your page, so meta information about your page. The meta elements are not visible to users, but they typically provide information to search engines and to browsers. So meta tags are the way that you tell a search engine about your page or provide some information to the browser about your page. Meta elements are empty elements, so they don't need a closing tag, and they use attributes to carry the information. So we'll go through some examples. So the description meta tag is used to provide some description of your web page to search engines. So typically, whatever is inside the description tag will be what's displayed in the search results. So, when you search for, do a Google search, you'll see like the title of the page, and the link, and then usually there's like a paragraph or a couple lines of a description text. So the meta description tag is how you provide that text to Google. So when Google crawls your site, they'll see that meta tag and they'll say, okay, here's what the description is, and then they'll show that to users when they're viewing your page on a search. It's not supposed to be more than 155 characters, but this is the way that works. This is the way all the meta tags work. So it's meta, and you use name with whatever the name of the meta tag is. So this is in the specification. So description is the type of tag that this is. So this will always be the same for this specific tag. But then in content is where you provide your custom content. So description, that's set. That's, there's no other, there's other options, but description is the type of tag. And then the content here is where you put in your own description. So less than 155 characters, whatever you want to display on the Google results page. Another one is keywords. So meta name equals keywords, and then you use a comma-separated list of keywords that your website should be searchable by. In theory, that's used by the search engines to attach, search keywords to your page. So if you add, websites, internet, and HTML, in theory, when someone searches for websites or HTML or websites HTML, your page should show up in the search results. But it's not quite as relevant now. It's still important to include these because Google still looks at them and they'll kind of use them to categorize your page a little bit. But unfortunately, these have been abused so badly that Google doesn't really do most of their weighting based on these meta tags anymore on this specific one. Now Google will actually read the text of your page, determine their own keywords via their algorithm, and use those keywords to rank your page, not whatever keywords you tell it. Because people got into trouble, you could put anything in here, so people would just kind of spam random keywords in here that they wanted to be on the search results for when their page had nothing to do with that or their page didn't have quality content. So now Google actually determines its own keywords based on the content of your page. But it's still important to include this, and it can still kind of help Google or other search engines. I think like Bing still uses these too. So if you don't include them, you might miss out on some search engine optimization. Robots is also an important meta tag, so it tells search engines not to add the page to your search results. So if you say, meta name robots, and then the content is supposed to be no index, there's some other options here, but no index is the one that tells search engines not to include this page in search results. That's pretty important, if it's a page that requires login, if it's a private page, like for a private group or something, and you don't want it to just show up in search results, you might want to add that meta tag to your page to tell Google, don't add this to the index, don't let it show up in search results. Any questions so far? Okay. This is a little bit of a different format. These are some newer meta tags. So you can provide your authorship information using this meta tag. So instead of the name, these use this HTTP equiv. So author is the one that provides the name of the author of the page. That can be useful. You can also give some caching information via meta tags. So HTTP equiv pragma and then content no cache. So there's some other options here but no cache tells your browser not to cache the page locally. That's also really important if you're building any sort of dynamic web application or something that's going to change rather rapidly, like a news website even, something like that. You definitely would want to say no cache, because otherwise, so your browser saves a local copy of every page you go to, and then when you go to that page in the future, most of the time they'll pull the saved copy rather than re-downloading the page. That's why you might have noticed sometimes, even with your development, if you change a page and then you reload it, sometimes it doesn't always get updated. If you do like Shift Control R or Shift Command R, Shift usually will is the keyword to clear your browser's cache, or you can go to I think it's like history maybe, file. I don't know where it is in Firefox to clear the cache. There might not be an easy way anymore. But I would just use Shift. Even if you hold Shift and click the refresh button, usually it'll clear your cache. But anyway, so a lot of times it's really important to tell the browser not to cache the page, because you don't want the user to ever see a saved copy, because it might be changing all the time. Most of the websites I work on, for work, we include that meta tag because things are always updating, things are changing all the time, and we don't want the user to see outdated information. You can also be really specific about when to expire a cached version of a page. So say you only update your page every day. Say it's like a news website and you know that you update it at 8 a.m. every morning and that's the only time it updates. So you can tell the browser it's okay to cache this page until this date. So you can use this HTTP equip expires tag. And with the content, you provide a date for when the page expires. So there's some websites where I've used this and actually given it a date like 2020. So there's some pages that I've known, okay, this page isn't going to change for a long time, but I want it to load really fast, so I want the browser to save a copy and to always use that saved copy. Give it a date far in the future. That's fine. You can always change this, and it'll cause the browser to update the page. But again, say you update it every day, change this to be the next day, so that it'll use the saved copy until it's updated. It can save, every time the browser loads the cached copy, one, it's super, super fast. Like, it's only going to take milliseconds to load your page because it's already saved. And two, it saves you bandwidth on your server so that your server's not getting hit again for another version of the page. Again, turning on caching, like this is a huge way to make a website load faster, at least feel like it loads faster, as well as reduce the load on your server. By getting your caching stuff set up correctly. Okay, any other questions about meta tags? There's a bunch of other meta tags you can use. This is just kind of an example of the most commonly used ones. There's all kinds of other ones that are more technical, giving information about the page to the browser. There's some meta tags that have to do with mobile optimization, so you can give the browser some idea of what to do when it's loaded on mobile, so whether or not it should shrink the page to fit or whether it should not do any shrinking, that kind of thing. So you can look those up. I just kind of wanted to give you an example of what types of meta tags are out there. Escape characters. So these are important. Some characters can't be used by HTML directly within content. So things such as, if you want a greater or less than sign, that's going to screw up your HTML, right? If you ever try that, if you've got a paragraph of text and you put a greater than sign in, your browser thinks you're starting in a new tag. It's going to ruin everything. Same with quotes. They're going to cause problems. So we use escape characters to use those characters within your content. So here's just kind of 4 examples. There's tons of other escape characters, and if you just Google escape character and then whatever character it is you want to escape, you can find that out pretty quickly. But these are the most common examples that you have to deal with in HTML. So you can use ampersand LT quote or semicolon to do less than or greater than. There's ampersand. I missed the semicolon there, but supposed to have a semicolon at the end. Or you use quote for double quotes. That's kind of the most common if you need to do a quote within your content. Typically, you want to use the Q tag, which will add those quote marks for you. But if you don't want to use the Q tag, but you need to insert a quote character, you can use the quote HTML or escape character to do that. One thing you have to be careful about is copying and pasting quotes from non-code sources. So I ran into this the first time I taught this class. Is people would copy HTML from the slides documents, which is fine, but this was written in Google Pages or whatever, and these quotes are like, I don't know if you can tell, like this quote is kind of rounded to the right and this quote's rounded to the left. They're called smart quotes. It's what your word processors typically add with quotes, because it knows if it's the start or the end quote, and it'll kind of use a special character for that. But if you copy it and paste it in your HTML, it's a different character entirely, and it's going to cause problems. So all that to say is be careful when you're copying content from like a PDF or like a Word document or something like that. If you're just straight copying and pasting, if there's quotes in there, they might be smart quotes, and it might cause you problems in the long run. I've fixed most of them. I've removed all the smart quotes from my slides, so it shouldn't be a problem. But just so you know, it can cause issues. Okay, HTML format. So we talked about this a little bit, but whitespace doesn't affect your HTML. So you can use whitespace to kind of make your documents easier to read. So for example, this is what not to do. But it's valid HTML, right? But if you look at this, you have no idea what's going on. You kind of have to sit there and stare at it and parse through, okay, we have a list, there's an LI, each item has an A, then with a bold tag and a closing A. It's just kind of confusing. So that's why it's important to break out each tag to a new line at least, and preferably to indent any child element so that it kind of makes a logical flow. It's also easy to miss closing tags if your HTML is too compressed. So that's why using our indentation kind of helps us, because if we miss a closing tag, we should see a big empty space there where it's supposed to be. So go ahead and add line breaks and indentation. It helps you catch mistakes. Your indentation should follow the structure of your document. Block level elements should usually be on a new line. You can have inline elements be inline. Like if you have a paragraph with some strong words, you don't have to break out those strongs into new lines or anything. They can just be inline. One important note too is not to use spaces in between parts of your HTML attributes. I see this a lot actually. So like your href and then spaces between the equals, you're not supposed to do that. Sometimes it'll work, but it's not valid HTML. Same with like your closing. If you have spaces between your closing, even if you do like your angle bracket and then a space and then the A, you're not supposed to do that either. It's really important that you do it correctly, because like your A should be the very first thing after your angle bracket, and then spaces separate out your attributes. So that's why it's important. So your A href equals with your value. And then if you had another attribute, you do a space and then that other attribute name. The problem here is that your browser thinks this is an empty. They see href, and they say, oh, there's no equals here, so there's nothing in here. And then they say, okay, now there's an equal. What does that mean? The browser doesn't know that these two are linked because there's a space there. So that's probably the number one issue I've seen with student HTML. They'll be like, HTML is not working correctly. It doesn't, get the class, and the CSS isn't being applied. You look at it and, oh, there's some extra spaces in there. That'll cause a problem. One note too, both double quotes and single quotes will work within your HTML. So like you could replace these double quotes here with single quotes and it'll still work. Really the main thing is just to be consistent. Your whole page should use the same, either all double quotes or all single quotes. I tend to stick with double quotes just because it kind of makes things a little bit easier when you're doing JavaScript later, or if you have any backend stuff like PHP or Node.js. It's a little bit easier if you use double quotes in your HTML, because then you can use single quotes in your strings that are providing the HTML. That kind of thing. Doesn't really matter, just as long as you're consistent. Okay, I believe that is the end. You now know all of HTML, so congratulations. We'll get started with CSS next week. So there's another quiz on HTML. We're going to do it a week from today, so next Thursday. I added it to the calendar on Blackboard. I'll upload these slides and the study guide for the next one today. So the next quiz will cover the last lecture, going through all of the forms and tables and stuff like that, and then this lecture as well. And then we'll get started with CSS, and we'll get to make things look good. So, all right, thanks, guys. If you need any help, the assignment 2 is due today at the end of the day. So if you need help with anything, I'll stick around for a little bit. How's it going?
Thank you so much for being so understanding.
Oh, yeah, no problem.
Can I take the quiz like after class, like next class?
Yeah, that'd be fine.
Okay, awesome.
Yep.
Then
Let me make a note on my calendar so I don't
And then
forget.
I can like I'll get you the assignment by Sunday night. Be good.
Yeah, that should be fine.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem.
I really appreciate it. At first I got the flu, and then I was like, oh, great, now I'm going to New Jersey, so yeah.
Yeah.
Then
no
I was like,
problem.
oh, and I have 3 exams this week. So
Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. I was just wondering, is there any way after you click the link to change the color of the link?
Yeah, it's a CSS property. You do like let's see, let's pull. Are you writing a CSS?
Yeah. So like,
Okay,
that's what I have so far.
nice. That's awesome. Let's see. Do you have a CSS file, or are you just writing it?
I'm just writing it.
Okay, yeah. Let's see. Let's
Uh,
pull here this. Okay, perfect. So what we'll do. So we have these A's. Are these the A's that you're wanting to?
Yeah, that's the link. To,
Okay, perfect.
And then it just links to the section early age.
Oh, gotcha. Sweet. So the way that you do that is with what's called a pseudo selector. So you do A and then colon visited. So whatever you put in there will style the link after
After
it's been
you click it.
Yep.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so
Cool.
much.
Yep, no problem.